They never wanted you to notice how observation truly works. You were taught to look at the world as if your eyes were neutral, as if seeing something only confirmed it. But the real engine runs in reverse. Reality doesn't follow your gaze, it answers your expectation. The moment you watch for what's missing, you multiply the missing. The moment you assume it's already here, the field bends quietly around that certainty. You grew up thinking observation was passive, but it quietly steers everything before anything appears. The visible world is the echo, not the cause. When you look to the outside to define what's possible, you lock yourself into yesterday's version of reality. But when you observe in reverse, assuming first, seeing later, the field shifts. What feels stuck is only your attention anchored in what already happened, not in what's becoming. The strange thing about observation is that it feels innocent. You look at what is in front of you, you take it as information, and you assume nothing changed because you merely noticed. But in the deeper mechanics of experience, observation behaves more like a steering wheel than a window. The moment you look at something, you're not just witnessing it, you're reinforcing the version of reality your mind already expects to find. This is the part most people miss. The power isn't in what your eyes see, but in the quiet expectation behind the seeing. If you look at your finances while expecting lack, you don't observe numbers, you observe the absence of enough. If you check your relationship while expecting distance, you don't observe the person, you observe the gap you fear will grow. And reality, responding to this internal signal, rearranges itself to confirm the state you carried into the observation. It's counterintuitive, because we've been conditioned to believe the world is objective first and responsive second. But energetically and psychologically, it runs in reverse. Your expectation precedes the physical snapshot in front of you. The external moment is already outdated the second you look at it. So when you observe to check whether something changed, you unknowingly stabilize the older version. You're asking the world to reveal something new while silently insisting on the old. That's the paradox. Observing reality from a state of wanting guarantees that the wanting persists. You go to the mirror of life, searching for evidence of improvement, and the mirror gives you exactly what your inner posture held, a reflection of waiting, not receiving. It's not because you're doing anything wrong, it's simply how the mechanism works. The field doesn't respond to desire, it responds to the internal assumption wrapped around the desire. This is why people often say results show up when they stop caring or forget about it. It's not magic. When the internal tension dissolves, the field is no longer being fed contradictory instructions. The absence stops being observed, so the absence stops being reinforced. The moment you stop checking, the reality you've been trying to invite finally has space to collapse into form. Observing in reverse means recognizing that the internal snapshot must come first. You don't wait for evidence to adjust your stance, you adjust your stance so evidence has something to follow. You assume the state of the outcome before the outcome appears, not as fantasy, but as orientation. It's the difference between waiting for the world to prove something and quietly knowing what the world will eventually show. When you understand this, observation becomes creative instead of reactive. You stop treating the physical moment as a verdict and start treating it as an echo, useful only as a reminder of where your attention has been. And when you shift that attention, the echo eventually changes too. Not because you forced anything, but because you finally stopped observing the world from the version you were unconsciously sustaining. There's a subtle trap hidden in the act of watching your life to see if something is changing. It feels responsible, even logical, to monitor the process. You set an intention, you take a breath, and then you begin checking for signs. You look at your phone to see if the message arrived, you revisit your bank balance, you replay a conversation to analyze whether it meant progress. But every one of these small inspections sends out the same underlying signal. Nothing has shifted yet. And because the field responds to the signal rather than the hope behind it, the shift stays suspended. Observation in the conventional sense becomes interference. The moment you check, you interrupt the natural momentum of what is trying to unfold. Not because the universe withholds anything, but because your state collapses back into the old pattern you were trying to move beyond. You try to stay open, yet your attention circles the absence. You try to stay confident, yet your mind asks for proof. This tension is microscopic, but powerful. It anchors the desired outcome into limbo. Imagine planting a seed and digging it up every morning to see if it sprouted. The intention is care, but the effect is delay. You never allow the invisible work to gather strength. In human terms, the same dynamic plays out every time you look for a sign that confirms your desire is coming. You're not checking the seed, you're interrupting it. Manifestation requires an internal continuity of state, and observation breaks that continuity because the nervous system switches from knowing to verifying. This is why letting go accelerates things, though the phrase is often misunderstood. Letting go doesn't mean abandoning the desire. It means releasing the compulsive scanning that keeps you tied to the version of reality where the desire hasn't arrived. To let go is to stop measuring the gap. It's a quiet exhale that frees your expectation from constant evaluation. When you stop observing for signs, your internal state stabilizes. Without the friction of doubt, the field can finally align with the assumption you set at the beginning. Letting go works because it allows coherence to form. When you're not busy checking whether the outcome has materialized, you naturally return to the feeling of completion. Your attention softens, your body releases the subtle vigilance, and your mind stops rehearsing scenarios about what could go wrong. In that ease, the original intention becomes clean again. The absence stops being fed. The desire no longer has to fight against the magnetic pull of your monitoring. Most people think their desire is delayed because something external is missing. In reality, the delay happens internally, in the constant oscillation between wanting and checking. The world mirrors that oscillation precisely. When you observe too soon or too often, your attention keeps resetting the timeline to zero. When you stop interfering, the unseen processes you initiated finally converge. There is a delay built into physical reality that most people never question. You look at what's in front of you and assume it is the present moment, but it isn't. It's the aftermath of countless assumptions, emotional patterns, and micro-decisions you made earlier without noticing. The physical world is always a rendered image of your previous state. By the time you can see it, it's already old. So when you treat what you see as your reference point, you unknowingly make yesterday the architect of tomorrow. This is why changing your life feels slow when you rely on visible proof. You keep checking the mirror to see if the new version of yourself has arrived, forgetting that mirrors never show what is becoming, only what has already been formed. When you use the outside world as the measurement of progress, you bind yourself to the timeline of the past. You collapse the same pattern again and again because your observation keeps refreshing the old frame. Reality inverts the sequence. The internal shift happens first. The external confirmation trails behind. You adopt a new posture, a new assumption, a new emotional tone. And nothing seems to change at first, not because nothing is changing, but because the physical plane is still catching up to the new signal. This lag is where most people lose coherence. They take the lack of visible movement as evidence that nothing is happening. And by doing so, they collapse back into the older state. The field realigns instantly with that doubt, and the cycle continues. When you understand the delay, you stop expecting immediate physical proof. You start treating your internal world as the active layer and the external world as the passive one. You realize that the feeling of already done is not imagination. It is the blueprint. And from that point forward, the physical begins reorganizing itself around that internal completion. Your reality becomes a delayed reflection of your own certainty. This shift requires a kind of emotional discipline. You have to hold the new state even when the world still shows the previous one. You have to look at the old picture without letting it define your expectation. Not through force, but through quiet clarity. You know the picture is outdated, the way a photograph from last month tells you nothing real about today. When you stop confusing the echo for the cause, you free yourself from the gravitational pull of what has been. And here's the subtle magic. The moment you stop needing the world to prove your shift, the world suddenly begins to show it. The reverse order starts making sense. You see after you know, not before. The physical becomes a witness to an internal decision that had already taken root. If this inversion resonates with you, let it land. And before you scroll away, engage with the process in a simple way. Like this message as a reminder that the visible comes last, and write in the comments, "I choose to see after I decide." There is a moment, quiet and almost imperceptible, when your inner world becomes coherent enough for reality to respond without resistance. It doesn't happen through effort. It doesn't come from repeating affirmations or forcing yourself into a rigid emotional posture. It comes from clarity, a clean internal signal, unpolluted by conflict. Most people imagine creation as a matter of intensity or repetition, but the field answers something far more subtle: consistency. A clean signal is not louder than a chaotic one. It's simply steadier. When your mind holds one image, one meaning, one emotional tone, even softly, the field aligns around it with surprising efficiency. But when your attention jumps between doubt and hope, analysis and desire, intention and fear, the signal becomes fragmented. The universe doesn't receive a clear instruction, it receives interference patterns. The result is slow movement, mixed results, or nothing recognizable at all. This is why observation, when done incorrectly, becomes counterproductive. Most people observe the world with a divided state. They hold a vision internally, but when they look outside, they look through the lens of the absence. They try to maintain confidence while scanning for what is missing. This duality creates a kind of static, an inner contradiction that gets reflected back to them in physical form. The outcome seems inconsistent, not because the desire is impossible, but because the signal is not clean enough to collapse into a single version of reality. A clean signal begins with simplicity. Not the simplicity of minimal effort, but the simplicity of alignment. One assumption allowed to settle, one feeling allowed to breathe without correction, one internal picture held without supervision. When you remove the noise, the checking, the worrying, the attempts to force intensity, the signal strengthens naturally. It becomes coherent because you stop interrupting it. Think of it like tuning an instrument. When the string vibrates purely, every note around it resonates more clearly. When it's even slightly off, every sound becomes muddied. The internal state works the same way. When your feeling matches your assumption, and your assumption is not being contradicted by your observation, the field responds with speed. You're no longer fighting yourself. You're no longer sending two messages at once. This is why complex techniques rarely outperform quiet, steady inner conviction. Complexity multiplies the chances of self-interference. Simplicity concentrates your energy. The more you try to do, the more opportunities you create for doubt to slip in. But when you allow yourself to rest in one clear internal stance, the signal becomes unmistakable. The power of simple observation lies in the way it removes all unnecessary layers. You stop trying to manipulate the external world. You stop looking for signs. You stop negotiating with your own desire. Instead, you observe internally. You feel what it's like for the desire to be already integrated, already normal, already yours. And the world, responding to that coherence, begins reconfiguring itself with surprising precision. Nothing about this process is forced. The cleanest signals require the least tension. When you stop trying to see the result and begin quietly knowing it, the field finally hears you. And when it hears clearly, it answers. There is a part of the mind that believes it is protecting you. It watches everything, measures everything, anticipates everything. It scans for danger, failure, delay, rejection, disappointment. It tries to stay one step ahead of life, as if vigilance could guarantee safety. But this same vigilant mind becomes the greatest obstacle when you try to create anything new. It collapses possibilities before they can take shape, because it keeps dragging your attention back to what already exists, what already went wrong, or what might collapse if you stop monitoring. This internal guard is not malicious. It is simply conditioned. It learned to survive by checking. It learned to avoid pain by predicting. But creation is not prediction, and transformation is not born from constant surveillance. When you attempt to shift your reality while this mind is on high alert, the process becomes heavy. You might set an intention, but the mind immediately questions it. You might feel aligned for a moment, but then the mind looks around to see if anything changed. In that instant, the old state is reinforced. The vigilance pulls you back to the familiar timeline. Children move differently. They assume. They play. They enter states wholeheartedly, without checking whether the world around them matches the story they're living internally. They're not naive. They're unfragmented. Their minds do not yet monitor the gap between imagination and physicality. They don't interrupt the signal with self-surveillance. As adults, we lose that fluidity because the mind becomes convinced that constant observation keeps us safe. But the vigilant mind works against the mechanics of manifestation. It wants evidence before relaxing, but evidence appears only after the internal shift stabilizes. It wants guarantees, yet guarantees cannot exist at the level of the physical until the energetic state has already been embodied. The mind looks outward to confirm progress, and the moment it sees the old reality still present, it concludes that nothing is moving. That conclusion immediately becomes the new instruction sent into the field. You can feel this mechanism in your body. The vigilant mind produces tension, subtle tightening in the chest or jaw, a quickened pace of thought. It demands clarity prematurely, insisting that the world should reveal the result before the state is ready. When this vigilance is active, even your desires start to feel like tasks. The joy of imagining becomes overshadowed by the pressure to verify. The internal world becomes secondary to the external one, and the reverse order of creation is lost. Learning to disarm this vigilant mind is less about fighting it, and more about redirecting it. You acknowledge its fear without obeying its impulses. You let it speak without letting it steer. Over time, you teach it that not everything requires monitoring, that some things grow best in silence, and that safety can come from a deeper place than prediction. As the vigilance softens, the gap between what you feel internally and what you see externally stops widening. You stop interrupting the process. You stop collapsing the old state. And for the first time, the new reality begins to find room to take form, not because you forced the mind into submission, but because you stopped letting it dictate the rhythm of your creation. There is a moment in every process of creation where things seem still, almost suspended. From the outside, nothing moves. From the inside, everything is shifting in ways the senses can't track. This in-between space is the most misunderstood stage of manifestation, because it's where people instinctively begin to monitor, compare, and check for signs. They want reassurance that the invisible work is happening, but by doing so, they unknowingly anchor themselves to the very version of reality they're trying to leave behind. Absence is seductive. It's loud in its own way. When something you want hasn't appeared yet, the mind tends to look directly at the gap. It observes what's missing and tries to solve that missing piece by paying even more attention to it. But observation is never neutral. Looking at the absence is the same as feeding it. You're sending the field a clear instruction. This is what I recognize as true. And the field, consistent in its responsiveness, continues to reflect that recognition. The mechanism behind collapse is more delicate than people realize. The field doesn't collapse into your desire simply because you want it. It collapses when your inner state stops contradicting it. Wanting and assuming are not the same thing. Wanting recognizes the gap, assuming erases it. As long as you're observing the lack, you're broadcasting an incoherent signal that keeps the possibility in a state of suspension. This is why the moment of surrender is so powerful. When you stop observing the absence, you stop energizing it. When you stop checking the timeline, you stop resetting it. When you stop insisting on visible evidence, you finally allow the invisible phase to complete its cycle. Letting go doesn't speed up the process in a magical sense. It simply removes the interference that was slowing it down. You can feel the shift internally. When you're still tied to the absence, there's a subtle tightness in your awareness, a leaning forward, a monitoring posture. It feels like waiting. But when you stop observing the lack, there's a release, a small internal exhale. Your attention no longer clings to what hasn't happened. It rests in a state that doesn't demand confirmation. In that quietness, the new pattern becomes coherent enough to collapse into matter. The mind often believes that vigilance accelerates results, but the opposite is true. Vigilance feeds the old state. It tells the field that you expect the old pattern to remain. The collapse only happens when the expectation shifts so completely that observing the absence becomes irrelevant. It's not denial, it's alignment. You're not pretending the absence isn't there, you're simply refusing to anchor your identity in it. In this space, the external world begins to reorganize, sometimes subtly, sometimes all at once. Opportunities appear, conversations shift, timing changes, and what once felt stagnant begins to move with surprising ease. Not because you forced anything, but because you finally stopped interrupting the mechanism. The field responds the moment you stop affirming the absence. And when that happens, collapse becomes inevitable, the natural consequence of an inner state that no longer contradicts the reality it's calling in. When you stop letting the outside world dictate your expectation, the entire rhythm of reality shifts. Creation begins to follow your inner stance instead of your senses. Observing in reverse becomes natural. You feel first, you assume first, and the visible world adjusts in its own time. The moment you release the need to check, life finally has space to answer. Tonight, choose one desire and hold it as already real for a few quiet seconds. Let the feeling settle, then release it without checking for signs. Give the field room to align before your eyes try to measure. If this message opens something in you, write "I shift from within" in the comments, and subscribe to receive more content in this frequency.